Welcome, everyone. I am Ellen Herman, co-director of the Wayne Moore Center for Law and Politics and professor of history at the University of Oregon. We are so happy that each and every one of you could join us today. We hope that all of you and your loved ones are healthy and taking very good care of yourselves. The mission of the Wayne Moore Center is to promote civic engagement, inclusive democracy, and justice by bringing together students, scholars, activists, policymakers, and members of communities, people just like you. We discuss a wide range of issues affecting Oregon, our nation, and the world. We work in the tradition of Oregon Senator Wayne Morse, who believed that political independence and education were building blocks of justice and democracy. Today's talk by Professor Alondra Nelson, The Social Life of DNA, Race, Reparations, and Reconciliation After the Genome, is one of the concluding events in our two-year exploration of science, policy, and the public. It also celebrates the Wayne Moore Center's 20th anniversary. We are so grateful to University of Oregon President Mike Schill, Vice President Yvette Alex Asenso, and the Division of Equity and Inclusion for their generous support in making this event possible and for featuring this talk as part of the university's African American Workshop and Lecture Series. Professor Nelson's talk is also supported by the Lorwin Lecture for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties. It is co-sponsored by the Black Studies Program and Minor. We are especially grateful to members of the Wayne Moore Circle. Circle members provide critical support for our programs through annual donations, small, medium, and large. Please consider becoming a Wayne Moore Circle member with a donation of any amount in celebration of our 20th anniversary. You can find information about that and about how to add your name to our mailing list in the chat. I am delighted that Alondra Nelson is with us today. Dr. Nelson, as many of you probably know, was recently appointed by President Biden to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, where she serves as Deputy Director for Science and Society. I can hardly think of issues that are more urgent in terms of our national and international future. But as if that weren't enough, she is also president of the Social Science Research Council and Harold F. Linder Chair and Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study. She was previously professor of sociology at Columbia University, where she served as the inaugural dean of social science. Professor Nelson is an award-winning sociologist. She has published widely acclaimed books and articles exploring science, technology, medicine, and social inequality, including The Social Life of DNA and Body and Soul, the Black Panther Party and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination. Professor Nelson has contributed to national policy discussions about inequality and the social implications of new technologies, including artificial intelligence, big data, and human gene editing. She serves on the boards of Data and Society Research Institute and the Center for Research Libraries, among others. Her essays, reviews, and commentaries have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Science, Le Nouvel Observateur, the Boston Globe, and on National Public Radio, the New Yorker Radio Hour, and PBS NewsHour. She also serves on the jury for the Andrew Carnegie Fellowship, whose new fellows were just announced, I think yesterday or the day before, and she was a juror for the inaugural Aspen Words Literary Prize. Professor Nelson will speak for about 45 minutes, and then there will be an opportunity for questions and answers from all of you, the members of our audience. Please submit your questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Questions won't be visible to you, but I will be collecting them, and I promise that I will get to as many as I possibly can. University of Oregon President Mike Schill will also be joining us toward the end of this event to join in the Q&A and also to offer a few concluding comments. So hang in there for that. And in the meantime, I bring you Professor Alondra Nelson.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for that kind introduction. Sorry, we're having a little bit of video challenge here. Let me share my screen and cannot wait to get started with our conversation today. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation over a year ago, probably closer to 2 years ago, to join you. And for everyone for being here this afternoon or this morning, as the case may be, depending on where you are. I started to give this lecture in October, and I fell ill in the midst of giving the presentation. And so we had to postpone things. And I received the most incredible outpouring of emails, cards, letters, flowers. It was just incredibly touching and moving, and it remains for me one of the most kind of profound and beautiful experiences of my life as a scholar. I am so grateful to all of you. I endeavored to reply to emails and write a few notes and reply to cards. I certainly couldn't have gotten back to all of you, but for those of you I was able to be in touch with, and particularly those of you I was not able to reply to personally, thank you so much. I'm completely continue to be boiled over by your kindness and your caring and your generosity, especially in this very difficult year and a half that we've been in. And it makes me, all the more sad that I can't be, having a visit in Oregon at the University of Oregon with all of you, now that I know what a just kind and incredibly generous community this is. So another time soon, I hope. So thank you, and I look forward to today's conversation. So I've changed the title of my work and my strategy a little bit for today from October, in part because I really want to distinguish between the work that I've done in the past and the work I'm doing now in the policy space, which needs to be kind of kept separately. So the title today is Science, Technology, and Medicine in African American Political Culture. And my thanks to the Wayne Moore Center, the Science Policy in the Public speaker series, and the African American Workshop and Speaker Series for sponsoring my visit. So first, a disclaimer: I'm speaking today in my personal capacity. The views expressed in my presentation are my own and reflect my views as a scholar based on my research, and do not in any way reflect federal science, technology, or other policy. Additionally, I will not be able to discuss or answer questions about federal science, technology, or other policy in this presentation, unless it's about policy from the historical periods in which I'm speaking. So to begin, I live in the tri-state area, and I was like you, sort of alarmed a year ago, March, when COVID-19 really overtook the tri-state area, both New York City and New Jersey. And I was also, as a scholar of African-American experience in science and technology and in health activism and health politics, was also unsurprised by, despite the confusion about what people should be doing to protect themselves, despite our just confusion around what was happening, what did we know about the pandemic, what did we know about COVID-19, I knew that there would be, and soon saw, places where African-American communities, often under-resourced, were finding a way to make a way out of no way. We're marshaling their resources, we're gathering together as community to figure out a way to protect themselves. And one of the really early leaders in this space was an organization called 696 Build Queensbridge, which is based out of the Queensbridge houses and public housing projects in Queens, New York. And this is March 17th. So March 17th, 2020, we had not yet, had sort of national policy around what we were going to do about COVID. New York was hit first, so things were starting to shut down in New York, but it was still an open question about what we were going to do. There were still sort of debates about whether or not everyone needed to mask or not mask and the like. And this disease was clearly going to hit African American communities more hardly, more strongly. And so I was not surprised, but I was also heartened to see the work of this community-based organization. Here pictured on March 17th, very early in the pandemic wave, passing out masks in their neighborhood and the Queensbridge houses, saying when there is crisis and when there are people in need, that's when it's time to show up and be a part of the solution and support. So at a time when we were having a debate about masking or no masking, here you had a working class and poor, indeed, in some places, Black community turning to local, community health workers in their community to get resources and information they needed to educate their community. This is Kay Bain, who is the gentleman that's pictured front in the blue, here in the gray sweatshirt. And this is him talking, outside of the Queensbridge houses, outside of the building where he leads this community-based organization, saying that he's dropping off masks and gloves. So this is 2 weeks later on March 17th. We need supplies desperately in our community. So we don't have a debate here about whether one should mask or not right now. This is sort of, we need to mobilize our communities to get resources, and we are doing this in our communities. And I wanted to begin also with just to remember Jason Hargrove. You'll remember he was a Detroit bus city driver who filmed a viral video on Facebook in which he talked about people getting on his bus. So this viral video was filmed on March 21st. And he was lamenting the fact and recording the fact that people were getting on the bus without masking, without abiding physical distancing and the like, and he was really lamenting his exposure to the coronavirus and really being on the front lines as someone who serves community as a bus worker, as a bus driver. So I want to offer these vignettes and these examples to begin to say that as much as we talked and should talk about health disparities and COVID-19, and the disproportionate effect on African American communities, with the late Jason Hargrove so brave and forthright in his video being a great example of, that we also need to understand that there were actions taken in this moment, including by organizations like 696 Queensbridge and by Mr. Hargrove, that really harken back to a longer tradition in which African American communities and other under-resourced communities understood that they needed to take their healthcare and advocacy for their healthcare into their own hands, including public health measures like masking and physically distancing. So I wanted to raise these issues to begin, and before I go back to some more historical work. And the question I really want to bring to the conversation today is this one. Why and how do communities that have been the objects of scientific scrutiny, technological surveillance, and medical apartheid become subjects and agents in science and medicine? So how do we get a Kay Bain? How do we get a Jason Hargrove, forthright, activist, and trying to get access to resources and really trying to understand a new emerging public health threat? I want to suggest, and how, moreover, do people become subjects, agents in science and medicine, we might also say in public health, against a backdrop of scientific racism, of this kind of technological surveillance and medical apartheid? And those have really been the kind of prevailing questions that really draw my work together, from my early work in Afrofuturism and Technicolor to my more recent work and the sort of social circulation and political uses of genetic technologies. So an alternate subtitle for my talk today might be, what do Black Panthers and root seekers, or what can teach us about race, health, and justice? And I'm going to draw on, as I mentioned, my book Body and Soul, as well as my publications, Genetics in the Unsettled Past with Keith Waylew and Catherine Lee, and The Social Life of DNA. So this is an image from Judas and the Black Messiah, a film that came out in the last year, which is about the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party. Some of you will know that Daniel Kaluuya won the Oscar a few days ago for Best Supporting Actor. And I clipped this still. I didn't do a video because videos always fail me on Zoom presentations, but I clipped a still for you instead. Because it was a kind of important moment, I think, in the sort of popular representation of the Black Panther Party. So this is the chapter is building up. Daniel Kaluuya is pictured in the black shirt. So that's he plays Fred Hampton, and in this scene, a member of the party's rank and file is going by with this machine that clearly looks like something out of the 1960s. The Fred Hampton character says, "What is that?" And he replies, "It's an EKG machine. It's for our clinic." So as I describe in my book, Body and Soul, the Chicago chapter of the Black Panther Party, for a time before, it was the sort of victim of federal surveillance and the COINTELPRO sort of mass surveillance program, in addition to what was effectively, an assassination at the hands of the police and federal authorities, had one of the most sophisticated sort of health activists and community health practices of all the Black Panther chapters. They had several different outposts, and it was not, given the sophistication of their clinics, it was not out of the realm of possibility that there could have been an EKG machine there. So I wanted just to share that by way of segueing from the contemporary representations that have taken us a long way to get to with regards to the Black Panther Party, to these former ones. This is from an archival photo from 1966, October 1966, when they were founded. And that was taken very much with their participation. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale even today are incredible architects of their visual iconography. And so, one must understand that the sort of strength and militancy displayed here, the bandolier, the guns, the leather jackets, were very much by design. But it was also the case that the Black Panther Party looked like this. Members of the party participated in a free breakfast for children's program, which was more widely known than the health programs and the genetic screening and testing program that I'll tell you about today, recognizing that one of the themes is around genetics for the work that you're doing at the University of Oregon. So this is a photograph from St. Augustine Church, Black Catholic Church in Oakland, about 1969. And so here's Charles Percy serving breakfast in Oakland, not wearing a bandolier or leather jacket, but indeed an apron. Black Panther members also look like this. This is Norma Armour, pictured giving a TB test to a little girl in a home in Oakland around 1971, wearing a white coat, doctor's medical coat that says the Black Panther Party's People Free Health Clinic on the patch there. Members of the Black Panther Party also look like this. This is Henry Smitty Smith, 1972. And the George Jackson's People's Free Medical Clinic. And I'll say a little bit more about what's on the walls and things in the clinic. So I want to suggest to you that by 1972, surely, but certainly by 1969, it was beginning that the Black Panther Party was, among other things, a health social movement. And they would also, they would mobilize sort of healthcare services, resources, information at large scale, community service, Black community survival conferences, such as this one in 1972 that took place in March and was covered in their newspaper in May of 1972 from the archive. This is the back of that same stage that gives you a sense of the kind of scale of the operation there. This was in what's called Bobby Hutton Park in Oakland, so local community members at the park. A free grocery giveaway behind, that's what the bags are pictured behind the stage. And in the spring and summer of 1972, the Black Panther Party were engaged in several of these Black community survival conferences. And I just are showing one of many flyers that I was able to locate in the archive. I want you to note on the bottom left here that they claim to have 10,000 sickle cell anemia tests on hand. So the Black Panther Party was, in the context of giving away, as they say here, free bags, full bags of groceries. They had entertainment. They were doing voter registration, and they were also doing genetic testing and screening. And as far as I've been able to discern, this is the first grassroots genetic screening and counseling project or program or initiative in the US. This is a photograph from one of their community survival conferences, a little girl here getting a sickle cell anemia test. And I'm going to say a little bit more about the testing a little bit further on in my presentation. And in particular, their genetic screening and testing was around the genetic disease, sickle cell anemia, that disproportionately affects people of African descent. The caption here, sickle cell anemia has claimed countless Black lives. We can accept this no longer. So let me say a few words about how it came to even be the case that the Black Panther organization that we think about romantically or critically in that original photograph that I showed you, the bandoliers, the black leather jackets, came to be very important health social movement actors, and actually very important in the space of thinking about race and science and race and health, and really, I think, set some very important precedents for later conversations about race, health, and science. So I want to suggest that the answer to why this came to be was a confluence of personal experiences, historical antecedents, and political influences. So first, a bit about personal experiences. I'm going to go through this a little quickly. So this is from 1969, the Daily World newspaper, in which the Black Panthers are interviewed about mapping their People's Free Medical Plan. This medical plan included the sort of announcement of the rollout of their clinics. I'm sorry about this, it's so pixelated, I thought it was a bit clearer. But more importantly, it talks about the fact that they're working as activists and that they need what we would call today self-care, that they were exhausted. They were working 18, 20-hour weeks. They were living communally. And that part of why they needed healthcare was not only because it wasn't available in the communities in which they live and the communities from which they came, but also that they really needed to take care of themselves if the social transformation that they imagined needed to take place was to be made possible. So part of it was a sense of like taking care of the community, but needing to take care of ourselves so we can also take care of the community. I also, one of the more prominent personal experiences is noted in Joan Didion's book of essays, The White Album, and the essay, The White Album. And in this essay, she is talking about her experience of attending the trial of Huey Newton. So this is Huey Newton here, pictured earlier on with the bandolier and the leather jacket, here laying on a gurney in Highland Hospital in Oakland, California. And he's been shot in the stomach in October 1967 in an altercation with police officers. And there's a lot to say about this photograph. I think one that's worth saying, whether or not you know who the person on the gurney is the way in which both medicine, the nurse in the background, and policing sort of create a sort of system often of medical control or surveillance and the experience of Black people in medical care. So that kind of spectrum from policing to medicine is not a wide spectrum, and they're kind of quite overlapping in some instances. And so Didion here recounts the testimony of a nurse who was tending to, and perhaps this nurse who was attending, but I haven't been able to prove that, tending to Newton that evening, and Newton asking to receive medical care, and the nurse first saying, do you have an insurance card? Are you a Kaiser? She kept saying to him, these were the early days of the Kaiser HMO plan. And he said, yes, I am a member of that plan. And she said, well, do you have your card? And, one doesn't, and, he wasn't driving around with his Kaiser card. And so she she denied him treatment. And then and in the course of denying him treatment, also, called the police to the bedside and the like. So in the end, we find out, and Joan Didion sort of wryly conveys to us that he was indeed a member of the Kaiser plan, but wasn't sort of treated despite that fact. So imagine Huey Newton, imagine the members of the party, David Hilliard and Ray Masai Hewitt, who are in the prior image, having their own experiences with the US healthcare system, and wanting to have an alternative to that. And this very much in some ways driving the reason why the Black Panthers became health activists. Another is historical antecedents. I suggest in Body and Soul that the Black Panther Party were part of what I call a long medical civil rights movement. That there was a tradition going back to plantation slavery. When you come, when you're in a community, cited in a community that doesn't have regular access to preventative or regular health care, either because of the plantation economy in which enslaved bodies and enslaved people were required only to be sound enough to work. The idea of thriving and healthy was not something that was a consideration for people who owned enslaved Africans. And it was also the case that under conditions of Jim Crow, that medical schools, hospitals, other kinds of health institutions were also part of the Jim Crow system. And so there's been this kind of long struggle that's part of the Black freedom tradition that's always been about access to healthcare and about both providing healthcare because of its lack of access, but also demanding access to the very best care. So let me show you just a few antecedents. This is a photograph, a Corbis Agency photo from the 1920s from Harlem of the Black Cross nurses. So these are the nursing cadre of Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association, which is in shorthand often known as a kind of Back to Africa movement. And what's interesting is that the Black Cross nurses were, their particular name was given to them, this cadre, in part because they were not allowed to join the American Red Cross. So the name, the Black Cross nurses, was a kind of critique of their exclusion from the American Red Cross. Some of these women had formal nursing training, some of them did not, but they're all wearing the nursing uniform. And I also want to note the sort of, both tension and I think constant and African-American experience on the one hand, carrying the Black Cross nurses and a kind of UNIA flag or banner, and on the other hand, laying claim to the American flag, even as a quote unquote Back to Africa movement, right? So laying claim to the ideals and of American democracy, even with a strong critique that was trying to make it, make the country live up to those very ideals. And that healthcare in this civil rights tradition has always been central. This is Fannie Lou Hamer, who you know for many reasons. She was lived as a sharecropper in the South, and she joined in Mississippi. And she was an incredible civil rights organizer and leader. So this is her on the stump organizing. And when she organized, she also often talked about something that she called the quote unquote Mississippi appendectomy. And this referred to her experience of being sterilized, of being given a hysterectomy without her permission or her prior knowledge in the course of going to see a physician. So for Fannie Lou Hamer, who was advocating for voting rights, who would go to the Atlantic City Democratic Convention in 1964 and try to sit a Democratic Freedom Party as an alternative to the all-white Mississippi Democratic delegation, the work of democracy, the work of civil rights was also about the work of health and about bodily autonomy and reproductive justice. So again, the long medical civil rights movement. And lastly, with regards to thinking about the historical antecedents that make it not surprising that the Black Panther Party and the more contemporary examples that I show you engage in discussion, conversation, debate about science, health, technology, that it's not just surprising, it actually should be expected. It is an enduring tradition. I offer for you a very famous quote by Martin Luther King Jr. That he said at a keynote speech in 1966 at an organization, at the annual meeting of an organization called the Medical Committee for Human Rights. So the Medical Committee for Human Rights is important in the Black Panther story because they are the kind of medical arm of the Freedom Summer campaign. And then they come back to cities in the North, cities in the Midwest, and work often with members of the Black Panther Party to establish, such was the case in Chicago, to help establish their clinics. And this quote, of course, is of all forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. And lastly, we should not be surprised that the Black Panther Party were leaders in the space of not just health politics, but also thinking about public health and a kind of critique of science, as I'll say more about, because of the political influences that they, widely avowed, the kind of theoretical and political theorists that they read. So these included Frantz Fanon, who we often think about as providing this blueprint for violence, right? So to the extent that one thinks about the Black Panther Party as very one-dimensional historical characters, like historical actors, linked to that one dimension is often, a kind of propensity to violence that, makes no sense, that's completely irrational, one can hardly even understand it. And that's often linked to a sort of not nuanced reading of the work of Frantz Fanon, author of The Wretched of the Earth, who was a Martinican psychiatrist who joined the Algerian freedom movement and who wrote as a doctor and an activist. And so in Wretched of the Earth, he does indeed talk about violence and violence as a kind of, necessary under conditions of colonialism, as a kind of necessary reaction to those conditions, and in some cases as the only hope for a different kind of future. But in the same book, he also writes a chapter on colonial war and mental disorders. So he's thinking about inequality and mental health in particular. And so to the extent that Frantz Fanon became an important ideological and theoretical figure for the Black Panther Party, it needs to be appreciated that Fanon was a physician and wrote as a physician philosopher, and that is laced through certainly this work as well as his other works. In addition, the Black Panther Party required the reading not only of The Wretched of the Earth, but this is a book list from the UC Berkeley archive of the Black Panther archive at UC Berkeley, that also included lots of folks that you would names you'd recognize. So John Hope Franklin was on this Black Panther reading list, Marcus Garvey, Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka, Kwame Nkrumah, and W.B. Du Bois, of course. But I want to note for you here another publication by Frantz Fanon, at this time called Studies in a Dying Colonialism, published today as A Dying Colonialism, which included a chapter 4, again, on medicine and colonialism, and used the sort of genre of the physician's case study to tell the story of the inability to have both sort of political freedom and actually physical embodied health under conditions of repression and inequality. So the Black Panther Party took up these political influences, historical antecedents, and personal experiences to develop a health politics that did two things. That dealt with the ways that African American communities that they came from and worked with were overexposed to the harms of medical apartheid, of medical experimentation and the like, and also underserved by mainstream medicine and by access to preventative and basic care. So I'm going to talk about the underserved piece today, but I'm happy to say something in the conversation about the overexposed. The Black Panther Party, as the slide from Judas and the Black Messiah suggests, set up a national network of community health clinics. By my calculation, there were clinics in at least 13 different locations, including there were 2 in Portland, Oregon, or maybe 3 in Portland, Oregon, actually. I'd have to check that. I think Portland had 2 kind of just regular health clinics, and they also had a dental clinic. Some of this was done with medical students and faculty from the local medical schools. So this is from the Los Angeles clinic, called the Alprentice Bunchy Carter Clinic on South Central Avenue. Gave you a sense of the clinic hours, that they were part-time. They were part-time and in the evenings and weekends, both because that was a time when members of the local community were not at work and could come. And it was also a time that was at which people who, and the volunteers at the clinics who, worked shifts at hospitals or worked, in other kinds of professions and volunteered at the clinic could be available to do that work. This is, I'm just going to show you some photographs of the clinics because they were varied. By 1969, this is Bobby Seale, Steele sends out a kind of mandate to all of the Black Panther clinics that says, if you're going to be a Black Panther Party clinic, you've got to sell the Black Panther newspaper, and you've got to have a free breakfast for children program, and you have to have a free people's medical clinic. But that clinic part often gets cut off of the historical narrative. So the challenge with the clinics, and why it often gets, I think, cut off in part, is that all chapters had to sell the newspaper, but the proceeds from selling the newspaper went back to the central chapter, to the central headquarters. It didn't really stay in the local chapters. And so the chapters were given the immense responsibility of setting up clinics and having to do it with local networks and local resources. And so that meant that the clinics looked all sorts of different ways. So this is the Berkeley clinic that Smitty Smith was holding the baby earlier, was pictured in. And you can see that they've taken a cell pathology chart, a textbook rather, and sort of wallpapered the walls there with it. You can see there's a microscope behind Bobby Seale. Not sure what that instrument on the right on the table is. Doesn't look like an EKG machine, but who knows, so that gives you one. This is also that same Berkeley clinic. This is their pharmacy, and that was resourced through, they used financial donations to buy things from stores. Things were donated by the Berkeley Free Clinic, which was an allied health project in the same community, and also medical students, and often gave leftover pharmaceuticals and medical equipment. In some cases, like at UCLA, that was being thrown away. So there would be kind of equipment that would be used once that could effectively be sterilized and used many more times. And sometimes that was brought to the pharmacy as well. And this is the Boston Clinic, Franklin Lynch People's Free Health Center. This was the clinic that Dr. Mary Bassett, who was the former New York City Health Commissioner, worked in as a medical student at Harvard. And she's now on the faculty of Harvard, runs their Center for Health and Human Rights. So these were the places where they cited their work to really respond to the ways in which Black communities were underserved by the mainstream medicine. And one of the central ways that they did that was through a sickle cell anemia campaign. And so this is the Black Panther Party in 1968, 69, 70, engaged in public conversation about genetic disease, about support for research for genetic disease, for care, and medical intervention for genetic disease. So I wanted to show you just this article. This is from the Journal of the American Medical Association, and which I think we would call a kind of racial health disparities, or a health disparities frame, is taken by a Richmond, Virginia-based doctor, Robert B. Smith, who argues and suggests here with data that sickle cell anemia occurs in about 1 in 500 Negro births, and median survival is still only 20 years of age. In 1967, there were 1,100 new cases of sickle cell anemia, 1,200 of cystic fibrosis, 800 of muscular dystrophy, and 350 of PKU. And Dr. Scott then goes on to talk about the fact that the funding disparities do not map on to the prevalence of these genetic diseases and communities. So this is a fairly reasoned, and the implication is clear that from philanthropy to what we now call patient advocacy groups to support from the National Institutes of Health, that this genetic disease, sickle cell anemia, that disproportionately affects African Americans, is not being supported in any of these domains to the extent that other diseases are that have similar or less prevalence. The Black Panther Party really takes this argument and amplifies it in the ways that you might imagine. And it becomes a kind of rallying cry for their sickle cell anemia campaign. This is them doing some medical students doing some, or there might be rank and file members of the party, but likely medical students doing sickle cell anemia tests at a park. Same here as well. So you can, the way that the tests were possible is that there's, you can see at the bottom of the screen there are test tubes. And so a test was introduced, a new biomedical technology called SickleDext that made it possible to do genetic testing and screening in a way that was mobile, that was less expensive than having to use what at that time were very large gel electrophoresis machines. And so what you could do here was put a blood sample and a test tube with a reagent, and the opacity or translucent of the resulting liquid could tell you whether or not someone was positive or negative for sickle cell trait or disease, but it didn't distinguish between the trait and the disease that needed to take place with additional testing using a gel electrophoresis machine, as well as with accompanied by genetic counseling. I just want to point you here to the sort of flyer that the woman who's getting tested and delighted by getting her blood taken, that says, what is sickle cell anemia disease? So part of the work here was to do a kind of written public health campaign. They were producing fairly regularly public health materials about sickle cell anemia for the Black community, in addition to doing the screening and testing. And there was a sense amongst the Black Panther Party that that one could put sort of medical information in their newsletter and that communities could get it. That to the extent that they thought they had a gauge on the capacity of the communities that they serve to understand, how genetic disease, in the case of sickle cell anemia, a genetic dominant, recessive Mendelian disease was transmitted. And so this is a reproduction of a graphic that was in the Black Panther Party newspaper that was trying to suggest to readers how sickle cell anemia was transmitted through a recessive gene from mothers and fathers to their offspring, and the percentage, of being normal, of being a carrier, 25% each, of having the disease, of being normal, 25% each, and then a 50% chance of being a carrier. So this is quite extraordinary, because I think often we think that we have to dumb down information to give it to communities for their understanding. And I think what the Black Panther Party really excelled at was telling a narrative about why the disease existed, why people should care about it, and what they needed to do to combat it, not distinct from the first slides that I showed you from Kay Bain and the Queensbridge houses. There was a narrative that was culturally appropriate to the community, that made scientific, information, the sort of genetic pedigree, make sense. And then they did things like go on the Michael Douglas show, which those of you who are my age or older will remember was a live telecast show. This included, this is there's a week in which Yoko Ono and John Lennon, who are pictured there in the middle, hosted a special week of the Mike Douglas show, and they invited Bobby Seale with the dark shirt, and Don Williams and Marsha Martin, who were members of the Black Panther Party, to come on the show. And Marsha Martin and Don Williams in particular talk quite a lot about sickle cell anemia. So this is a live variety television show. Other portions of this week included Yoko Ono doing music videos. There were musical guests from R&B and rock and roll. And so here you have these very serious members of the Black Panther Party talking about genetic disease, because they understood it was an opportunity to reach a very important and large community about this disease that disproportionately affects people of African descent, and to talk about their community survival programs. And the Black Panther Party, little known, often also engaged in public debates with the connection of race and genetics into sort of spurious claims about IQ and what they called inferiority theory. So this is from 1973, their newspaper. Bobby Seale and Elaine Brown, leaders of the party, have a press conference on the campus of UC Berkeley, where there's been Charles Jensen has had a conference on genetics and IQ on campus, and they hold a press conference in which they effectively say we're not against genetics at all. They say let 1,000 such studies bloom if that's how the nation wishes to use its scientific resources. But what they identify, and I think it's an issue that will resonate with us even today, is that Jensen was, particularly interested in comparing Black people and white people, and sort of the tautology of assuming that there was a difference and then finding one. So they offered, why not do a study of all ethnic and racial groups in this press conference? And they say few scientists seem interested in comparing, say, Northern Italians with Southern Italians or Appalachian whites with social register whites. And so here you have the Black Panther Party really questioning the framing of the research and the research questions, and not so much being just anti-genetics for the sake of it. So what I want to suggest is that the Black Panther Party, in sort of engaging in conversation and public discourse about genetics and race, as we would probably frame it today, in the 1960s, late 1960s and early 1970s, really set the terms of debate for the Tuskegee syphilis study, which has become our kind of national allegory or our national myth, our national tragedy, our national heartbreak for the sort of tragedies that occur in medical research, medical experimentation, and again, the framing of questions about medical investigation. I mean, that the sort of framing, one of the framing questions of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment is, is syphilis different in Black bodies, right? So that much like Jensen, the sort of question that there was something distinctive about Black biology that, that somehow necessitated, quote unquote, a 40-year study in which Black men, nearly 300, were left untreated for syphilis, and in some cases in its tertiary and most dangerous and deadly form. So the Black Panther Party reported this as germ warfare declared against Blacks. They're very propagandistic framing this, the challenge to inferiority theory image, with often also propagandistic in its framing, and indeed, I think, misogynistic as well. But I think it is the case that that the Black Panther Party, as I said, set the terms of debate for Tuskegee and not vice versa. Indeed, Tuskegee comes to the national stage on July 28th, 1972, and by that point, the Black Panther Party had already been engaged in public conversation, debate, and engagement, both intellectual engagement and through sort of practical healthcare services for 2 years, if not 3 years. So I want to suggest that we need to rethink the idea of medical apartheid or medical experimentation as being unchallenged. That there have been throughout this long medical civil rights movement endeavors to identify, to prevent, to amplify the sort of abuses of medical apartheid and experimentation, and that is a legacy that is also part of the Black Panther Party legacy. So I want to switch gears now and talk to you about my more recent work, which is also another story about African-American communities and genetics, but this through some highlights from a 10-year ethnography I did of the emergence of the direct-to-consumer genetic testing market here in the United States. So these are photographs from my fieldwork beginning in 2003, where I spent time with African-American genealogists, folks who were interested in tracing their roots. As the genealogy practice was turning from being something that was really a brick and mortar, you go to the archive, you spend your summer in the archive practice, to one that was, making use of the sort of adjunct uses that came out of in genetics as a result of the Human Genome Project. So this is early in my work in which you still had to really compel conventional genealogists who are, for the most, until it became more democratized and popular over the last decade, but for the most were middle class, upper middle class people. You have to have leisure income, you have to have time, often people who are retirees, often quite well educated. That was my sample. But even these folks had to be compelled or convinced that genetics could somehow have some resonance for the work that they were doing. So these are photographs I took from a DNA 101 presentation that was being given to some genealogists to suggest to them that genetics might be useful for their genealogical pursuits. So you see a woman here holding the model of the double helix, and these folks are holding up these sort of models of proteins that comprise the nucleotides that comprise DNA. So in my early work, I certainly found talking to these folks about their experiences, some of which who would go to use the early direct-to-consumer genetic genealogy companies. I found myself talking to them about their experiences, and some of the initial accounts were not dissimilar from what we see on with the other industry that rose up precisely parallel alongside the direct-to-consumer genetic testing industry, which is this industry in direct and genetic sort of reality television shows that really began in the UK, and with things like Motherland, A Genetic Journey, which I think is from 2002 on BBC4, and then come to the United States. So people were surprised, they were elated. Morgan Freeman here is crying. If you saw the episode with Chris Rock of African American Lives, I think later in that episode he's crying as well. People were deeply moved. But because I spent time with folks after this initial moment of kind of revelation, I came to see what I call as the social life of DNA, how DNA information analysis sort of circulates in the world. And I also came to ask the question, why, as I got 5 years into the research, why is this industry sticking around? So again, those of you who are my age or older will remember that we had another moment where there was just this sort of high watermark of interest and excitement around what I call root seeking. And that was in 1977, in 1976, when Alex Haley's book, Roots and the Saga of an American Family was published. And then in 1977, the first, or maybe one of the first US miniseries ran for 8 consecutive nights. So the televised version of Alex Haley's book. And so, this is during my childhood, and like Roots was everywhere. There were, coloring books and lunch boxes and television shows. And as you see, both the covers of Time and Ebony magazine. But certainly, I'm not, at least in my memory, and memory is objective. By the time we get to what we understand as the Reagan era, we no longer think of sort of root seeking as being part of that kind of cultural zeitgeist in the same way. So that bubble sort of comes up and down. So why with genetic ancestry testing was it up, 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 and it didn't go the way of the hula hoop or other kinds of fads and stuck around? So for me, that's the sociology, that's the social science question. What's sticky about this social practice? What is it doing for people? What is it doing in the world that makes it stick around? And moreover, I would say, if we think about the direct-to-consumer genetics market as being in part of this, the larger kind of domain of tech startups, there's a way in which it could have gone the way of most tech startups, which is like they don't succeed, right? But yet this market and direct-to-consumer genetics persists. So I want to suggest that one of the reasons there's lots of reasons we can talk about that it stuck around is that it offered the opportunity to begin to answer some questions for us in the United States around the history of racial slavery. So the Human Genome Project starts in 1991. And by 1998, some of the sort of insights and technologies that this project makes possible are being turned to in important scientific journals like Nature, questions about the past. So this is a very famous paper that became somewhat controversial, and now the conclusions are, well, we can talk about it, titled "Jefferson's Father, a Slave's Last Child." So this was an attempt to use genetic ancestry testing to adjudicate the sort of account of the sort of question of whether or not Sally Hemings, a Black woman enslaved by Thomas Jefferson, was the mother of her children, or at least some of her children. So we can talk more about this, but I just wanted to make that point about why it was sticking around. So in my work, I'm interested, and I would class this Nature paper on Jefferson's paternity of at least one of the Hemings children under a category of kind of social phenomena that I call reconciliation projects. And for me, these are the seeking of resolutions of injuries deemed to have been produced in the past by racial slavery, and through which genetics is used to kind of reconcile them and to resolve them. So reconciliation projects for me take up lots of forms. It's about diaspora, it's about DNA citizenship, it's about making diasporic connections with new communities here in the United States. But today I want to just talk to you about a company that I studied, most significantly, called the African Ancestry Company, and the way that this company came to be, its origin story. But I want to say, of course, that there are lots of questions that one can and should and does pose about genetic ancestry testing. It makes often ahistorical, large assumptions about what is history, what is quote unquote race, what is quote unquote ethnicity, how do we think about the time of history, how far back in time do certain ethnic groups, racial groups, all of this in scare quotes go. So I want to point you to a policy paper that myself and some dear colleagues did in Science, probably now a decade ago, called The Science and Business of Genetic Ancestry Testing, which is open access, that goes through the kind of limitations of genetic ancestry testing, and I'm happy to say more about that. But I also want to talk about its unexpected possibilities. So this is Rick Kittles, African-American geneticist who might be known to some of you. I spent, as part of this decade doing my research, quite a bit of time following him and his emergent company around, African Ancestry Incorporated, which starts in 2003. But I want to go to the sort of prehistory of the African Ancestry Company, because I think it suggests for you, for us, how it's possible that genetically inferred identity, so we think about the African American Lives or the other series that Skip Gates does on root seeking, how does this genetically inferred identity become not the endpoint, but a catalyst for other things in the world, for the social action that I call reconciliation projects? And how can genetics, a practice that has ties to eugenics, that has ties to use the Black Panther phrase, inferiority theory, that has ties to practices that are, dangerous for, and particularly for African American communities, for communities of just Jewish descent. How do we, square the knot square the circle on this? So let me just say a little bit about this and wrap up. So the African American African Ancestry Company emerges in part out of a project, the African Burial Ground Research Project, which starts in 1991, around the same time of the Human Genome Project. Archaeologists in Lower Manhattan were going to, the federal government, actually GSA, General Services Administration, was going to put up a federal building in Lower Manhattan on a site in Lower Manhattan that had been shown through historical maps to likely either be next to or on top of a burial ground that was called the Negroes Burying Ground. And I come from Southern California, where sort of cultural preservation policies are much stronger. So, in California, if you had evidence that you were sitting next to or on top of a historical burying ground, you would really have to do some other work. In New York City at this time, you could begin the construction and sort of see if it was true. So this project begins as a construction site and of course quickly becomes an excavation site because it was the case that they were sitting, the construction was being done on top of the African burial ground, or the Negroes burying ground as it was called. So initially it is being excavated by, in shorthand, we might call like a CSI lab. So the City University of New York, Lehman College, very fine scientists there in the Metropolitan Forensic Anthropology team, but not anthropologists or biological anthropologists with expertise in African American history or the culture of enslaved populations, or even kind of funerary practices, but were more kind of forensic analysts. So initially, the remains are being analyzed by the fine scientists of the City University of New York. But this becomes a very controversial project for all the reasons that you might imagine, including around, who sort of symbolically and who maybe, kind of regulatory sense had kind of control over the disposition or the decision making about what should happen with these remains. So the very prominent Black physical anthropologist or biological anthropologist, Michael Blakely, was consulted by the local community. He was at the time at Howard University, he's now at the College of William and Mary. And he was asked to take a look at what was going on. And he said, well, Lehman College, their methodology reduced the individuals in the burials to, quote, narrow typologies and, quote, thinly descriptive variables, and thereby disassociated them from their, quote, particular culture or history. So for Blakey, this burial ground represented a rare opportunity to be able to ask historical questions using an array of methods about potentially enslaved Africans, but but also perhaps colonial era enslaved or free people of African descent in New York City, a rare find, a rare opportunity. To his mind, what the Lehman College scientists would do, because they work in another kind of empirical tradition, which was to do things like, measure a femur, weigh a femur, and sort of try to discern from this whether or not they thought it was, quote unquote, black. So Blakey was brought in, was very critical of the African burial ground project approach taken by Lehman College, and takes over as the research director for the African burial ground, also giving the project a tie to the important Montague anthropology lab at Howard University, where he was at the time. In addition, there was a social movement group that called themselves Descendants of the African Burial Ground. So this is really before any research is done. So the kinship claim of descendants is, a political kinship claim. And this is, I think, for me, one of the more important slides I want you to take away from the conversation this afternoon as I'm wrapping up. And that is that they understood a distinction between what they called biological racing, that would reduce their ancestors' social identity to skin color, and a way of using genetic analysis incorporated with other methods in the way that Dr. Blakey suggested that could actually be beneficial. So here is, like the Black Panther story on genetic testing and African Americans with genetic disease and African Americans. Here you have an activist, a local community activist saying, we're okay actually with genetic analysis if it's done in a way that does not just have what they call merely descriptive frameworks that to their mind, as I said again, resulted in biological racing. And they laid claim to, as did Blakey, what was called a biocultural interdisciplinary research strategy that included things that, what might surprise people, craniometrics, the long-standing practice of craniometry, a sort of investigation of phenotypic traits, the use of dental morphology, but also the use of archaeology, history, and molecular genetics. So the use of all of these together in this biocultural interdisciplinary strategy meant that no one way of knowing about the past through this investigation trumped the others, right? You weren't saying that whatever the molecular genetic evidence is, that tells us everything that we need to know about these communities, deceased Black communities. Rather, you're saying bringing all of these things together allow us to tell a full story, and a story that is not, that's deeply evidence-based, that's deeply empirical, but is not a project of biological racing because it's not engaged in relying on one of these to the deficit of the others. So to wrap up, I want to just offer two observations, one about the social construction of technology as a kind of thematic, and to wrap up about talking about expertise and trust. So the change, as I suggested to you, there was a change in SCA or sickle cell anemia testing that facilitated the Black Panther Party's ability to do their grassroots, out in the open at auditoriums, at gyms and parks testing. This new SickleDex, SICKLEDEX test was portable, was affordable, was easy to use, and this is what it looked like. So those test tubes that you saw mixed with the reagents, right? So this the N being normal, and the dark one being having a sickle cell disease, and then the carriers and normal, the darker ones being carrier status, and the lighter ones being not indicating sickle cell disease or trait. But it was the cultural priorities and political exigencies that made SickleDex the right tool for the job. It allowed them the Black Panther Party to really carry out their DIY or kind of self-determination ethos. It allowed them to exercise a critique of expertise and a challenge to authority. It allowed them to work around and through their mistrust of mainstream healthcare. And it was also a necessary and urgent response to medical neglect. And a word about expertise and trust. Expertise concerns not only knowledge or education, but also trust. And I want to suggest that a figure like Rick Kittles, who's established the African Ancestry Company that I write about, the genetic direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing company, as well as the Black Panther Party, were bioculture brokers, that they were mediators for populations that had been the objects and subjects of science. In which experts can we have confidence? I want to suggest that there's a category of trusted experts who vet allies, who understand how to convey information in a political context, who understand that part of the work of being a trusted expert is helping to set the terms of debate, and also in some instances redefining or defining or redefining research parameters. Something that we saw both with Elaine Brown and Bobby Seale, sort of speaking back to Arthur Jensen and about inferiority theory, and also at the African burial ground, now a national monument in Lower Manhattan, with regards to the local community saying, if we ask different questions, richer questions, more nuanced questions, it's okay to incorporate genetics into the work. So last slide here is just to take us back to the present. It's somewhat present where we began with the project of the Black Doctors COVID-19 Consortium in Philadelphia, who were leveraging, this is from Smithsonian Magazine, it's a lovely article about Dr. Alla Stanford, leveraging their medical expertise, their trusted expertise, right? And their connections to provide testing and vaccine. And as you know, some of these conversations about vaccine were initially about access, but it was also about sort of trusted access, to whom are the people that you trust to receive the vaccine from. So I will stop there and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Nelson. And now is the time for all of you, members of our audience, to put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And while I wait for that to happen, let me just start with a question of my own, related perhaps to both the first and the last slide that you showed about the mobilization of Black physicians currently to promote kind of, a trusted information circulating in Black communities and in other communities of color. I think for me, this has been a very noticeable dimension of the response to COVID. And I'm wondering if you see this as simply part of the long kind of medical civil rights movement that you described, and which I suspect you do, but also the extent to which Black physicians and other Black scientists themselves, whether the participation of African Americans in the medical and scientific workforces as experts themselves, as opposed to grassroots activists. I'd be interested in hearing your commentary on that, and at what point perhaps the long medical civil rights movement also came to prioritize the sort of medical and scientific education of members of those communities.
Great question. Thank you for that, Ellen. So, I mean, I would make it part of that tradition. I think it's an ongoing tradition, but of course the context for different kinds of endeavors changes. So, it is a very different, we no longer have, formally Jim Crow hospitals or, medical schools or nursing schools and the like. So, so this long tradition continues, but that the sort of valences are a little bit different in the contemporary moment. And it's always been, in Body and Soul, I kind of talk about several strategies that Black communities have used across this long civil rights movement. One of them is recontextualization, which I tried to demonstrate with the example of Elaine Brown and Bobby Seale having this press conference about race and genetics, in which they're really trying to reconceptualize the terms of the debate. Like they're sort of, and saying that we could ask very different questions and come up with very different outcomes. But another of the key strategies was that I have in Body and Soul is institution building. And so that institution building really included the creation, and people like the historian Darlene Clark Hine write beautifully about this. The creation of, by necessity, Black medical schools, Black nursing schools, that when, so this time, the early 1970s is also the first time push is being made to really diversify in any way mainstream medicine or nursing, and so we see the sort of shift from, and this goes to my point about how the long medical civil rights movement continues, but it sort of changes and ebbs and flows with the context. So we go from having sort of Black hospitals, Black nursing schools and medical schools and the like, to having the formation of African American nurses associations, or the National Medical Association as a critique of the American Medical Association. So even as there's modest opening up, there's still a kind of understanding that for Black doctors, for Black clinicians and medical professionals, that their experience as professionals is not going to be like their colleagues who are not from marginalized communities, and that they've got special concerns, and that their communities have special concerns as well. And then, of course, and I don't want to go too far down this road because I don't have any of the literature in front of me to give you a good citation, but there is literature that suggests that the participation in healthcare of clinicians of color often can lead to better outcomes, and even if those are people feeling respected and heard, which as we know is as important as for healthcare and for thriving. It's an important part of healthcare, kind of a humane encounter and experience as much as sort of medicine itself.
Okay, wonderful. We now have lots and lots of questions, and I will try to get to as many as I can. Thank you for the fascinating presentation, Dr. Nelson. I'm just reading the question. Could you discuss the potential advantages or concerns in using genetic testing in the racial justice policy realm? For example, using genetic analysis to substantiate claims for reparations.
Yeah, so I didn't talk about the reparations piece because it ventures too much into contemporary politics. So I will point you to my book. I will actually send it to you. I will help you to send you the chapter, but I don't want to venture into that just because it literally, quite literally, is happening on the Hill right now.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, great. Here is another question from one of our resident scholars this year. Has the wider interest among the African American community in not seeking via direct-to-consumer genetic ancestry testing changed over time? In root seeking, I'm sorry. In root seeking, changed over time, and in particular, has it been affected by the wider acknowledgement of the rise of police use of genetic ancestry databases?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I will say that early on in my early interviews, there was a concern. So I think what's so fascinating about doing research, I mean, obviously the narcissism of one's own project, but I think for me what's fascinating in part about working with African Americans and asking questions about science and technology in the world is that these are communities that are always having to do that kind of risk assessment. So very early on in my research, I had people saying, I don't know where this DNA is going to end up. What if it does end up someplace I don't want it to end up? And that was, on the one hand, a kind of concern about experimentation, but on the other hand, also about policing. I will say, what makes it a lot more complicated. And so one of the takeaways really for, I want folks to have is really just that this kind of topic space is more complicated than I think often it is conveyed, and that African Americans are doing very complicated and often admirable risk assessment and kind of risk calculation with regards to whether or not, to your question, the benefit of being able to get information, genealogical information using these then new emergent genetic tools, and not really knowing where your DNA was going to go. I mean, part of the reason why Rick Kittles, who I showed you from the African Ancestry Company, is a trusted expert is because he would often in his presentations talk very explicitly about that fear. So he would say, I'm not going to let your DNA go astray. Like, it stays with me, and then I toss it. I toss out the wet pieces, and I think he also tosses out the data. So I think that that people were constantly thinking about that. The other thing I would add is, like, around the same time, there are all of these interesting phenomenons happening in the late 90s and early aughts. And another of them is the emergence of, the Innocence Project. And so there is a kind of parallel story about policing, one that, genetics gone to the wrong hands could loop you into a very dangerous space, be that in policing or research that you didn't want to participate into. On the other hand, there were these increasing instances in which people who had long been wrongly incarcerated were being released based on DNA evidence in the criminal justice system. So great question, and I'm just tossing back to you that it's even the question around policing and privacy of one's genetic data has these kinds of two, not exactly countervailing, but kind of parallel tracks that folks are really measuring and weighing when they make these consumer decisions.
Wonderful. We have a question from Françoise Bayless, who I believe you know. She occupied the Wayne Morse chair this year, and we had numerous discussions about genetic testing and other related issues while she was with us. She asks, there are different and conflicting media accounts of vaccine hesitancy in the Black community. Some make the point that this is not surprising given past abuses at the hands of the medical system. Others say the problem is not vaccine hesitancy, but vaccine inequity, that Black communities do not have easy, timely, equitable access to vaccine. Can these different accounts be reconciled?
Oh, what a great question. I know we can't see you, but I would love to know your answer to that question, actually, given your work. I think one doesn't have to reconcile them. I think one has to understand that they exist together. And so, I think that it is, that healthcare inequality by income, by race, by zip code, access to the proximity of a hospital or a clinic is real and pronounced, whether or not we're dealing with a pandemic and having to get access to vaccine or not. So that, I think, to me, tips into being just a truism. And that hesitancy, I think, is one of these spaces in which, I really want to admire and to appreciate underserved communities' need to be constantly making these like risk calculations. And so, certainly there may be, I think, vaccine hesitancy, but I would say, that the historic harms are long-standing. So, the harms and the inequities are long-standing, and that, Black communities in particular are kind of living through navigating healthcare in this space for, a very long time. And so I think that a moment like a pandemic, I think shines a light on these particular issues. But I would say that to the extent that both historic inequity and the kind of hesitancy variously are manifestations of like historical experience that they're kind of enduring constants, and that the pandemic has only has shined a light on them, but not made them, not created them wholesale.
Here's a quick question from a PhD candidate at the University of Oregon. Given the scarcity but valuable genetic data from people of color, should companies like Ancestry and 23andMe offer their service for free to members of these communities?
Oh boy, what a great question. Free, right? So what is the aphorism that we use in our data-centric society? If something is free, you are the product, right? Or something. What is the phrase? It's a bit more lyrical than that. But to talk about, even things like Facebook and Google, the kind of big tech economy, any of these things that are free are sort of operating on, are sort of data is being used to sort of make profit and other ways. So I would say no, because it's not really free. Yeah. I would also say that there's one case I wrote in the British Journal of Sociology a couple of years ago. I've been following the what's been happening at Georgetown with the descendant community there, the descendant of enslaved Africans who were sold by Georgetown College in 1838 down to plantations, Louisiana, to keep Georgetown afloat. So the reason that there's a Georgetown University today is in part because of this transaction. And one of the complexities there is that if you identify, so there's a nonprofit started by an alum named Richard Cellini called the Georgetown Memory Project that does conventional and genetic genealogy for people who think they were descendants. And it is through these two techniques and through in working with genealogists who have expertise in Louisiana in particular, that they've been able to, gosh, I think the last I heard, estimate that there is a descendant community, a living descendant community of somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people. Like I don't actually remember the latest figures. So here's the challenge here, and this is just throwing back a question in response to the question, is that in this instance, one had to, I think, initially pay. So if you had like very preliminary evidence that you might be a descendant, one of the GU272, then you had to buy from Ancestry.com a test, and then sort of get your results and join this GU272 community, so then that your DNA could be compared, and one could discern whether or not one is biorelated to some of the other folks in the community. So, on the one hand, one thinks, why should someone have to pay for that? Why should you have to give Ancestry.com, money to be able to find out who your ancestors are, given, the sort of horrific reasons why you don't know? But on the other hand, I don't know if, giving it for free is also, giving data to this company. And we know that Ancestry, it's well reported in the press, has sometimes cooperated with the criminal justice system. We know that Ancestry, does keep their data at like 23andMe, and has been leveraging it for other purposes, 23andMe for pharmaceutical research. So, I think that again, I would go, I'll end where I began, which is that, there's a cost to free as well, in a kind of biotech or data-centric economy that has to be weighed. And I think we see people understanding that and making that calculation as well. Early in my research, people would say, often sometimes their narratives about using different companies were because one company could give them, I didn't show it in a slide, but African Ancestry provides as an output what they call it with a certificate of ancestry. So it says, congratulate, Alondra, you've been inferred to be, related to, in my case, the Temne people. No, that's not me. The Bamileke people of Cameroon. I did a mitochondrial DNA test with them. So, but in other instances, you just get the data, you get SNP markers and these sorts of things. And so people were sort of saying, well, I really want something I can use to do this kind of rich storytelling in the contemporary moment. But it was later in my research, towards the end of it, where people started to say, well, are they going to use my data for other things? And so free or not free, I think the question of the sort of subsequent circulation of one's data, was becoming a concern by the time I was out of the field.
Well, Alondra Nelson, our time with you has just flown by. I want to thank you again and everyone who is out there in the audience for spending the time with us today. I certainly learned a great deal. I'd like to turn this over just for the last few minutes to U of O President Mike Schill, who has agreed to offer just a few concluding remarks. Welcome.
Thank you, and I'm sorry I was late to this. I just want to thank you, Professor Nelson, for being with us today. I'm sure that the conversation could have gone on for hours and hours more, and I think it will go on for hours and hours more here in Eugene. I want to thank you for creating this opportunity for our community to continue to grapple with issues of genetics, equality, and justice. I hope you'll be able to come to our campus so we can actually see you in person and continue the conversation in person when it's safe to do so. And I'd also like to congratulate you on your recent appointment to the Biden administration's Office of Science and Technology Policy. I'd like to also, I guess my job is thanking, I'd also would like to thank the Division of Equity and Inclusion and the Wayne Morse Center for Law and Politics for hosting today's lecture and the discussion. And just mention that this year is the Morse Center's 20th anniversary. And it is a jewel. It's an invaluable resource for our students and faculty, for community members, for leaders throughout Oregon and beyond. It plays a vital role in fostering civil discussion about the critical issues we face as a state and nation, like the discussion today. And I'd also like to give a special thanks to the donors who have supported the Wayne Morse Center. And I hope all of those who are still out there will join me and donate to the Wayne Morse Center today, so it will continue its mission for years and years to come. Lastly, thank everybody who's out there for joining us today. And once again, Professor Nelson, thank you for a thought-provoking lecture and discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you, President Schill.
Yes, thank you so much, President Schill. Just one last word for those of you who are still out there. We will have another lecture next week, which will be of interest to those of you who tuned in today. Evelyn Hammonds, a very wonderful historian of science and medicine, will be speaking on May 4th at noon. Her subject is historicizing COVID-19, challenges and questions. Professor Hammonds is professor of history and African-American studies at Harvard University, where she is also chair of the Department of the History of Science. If you are interested in that, it's not too late to reserve a spot. One final thank you from the bottom of our hearts, and good luck, and thank you for the work that you are doing now, Alondra Nelson.
Thank you, Ellen. And I will say Evelyn Hammonds is also my dear mentor of many years. So you will learn so much from being with her. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, goodbye. See you soon.
Bye-bye.